Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 118 of ASBN Live. I'm Tulasi Sivalingam, the Manager of Programming and Events here at ASBN. And today is part of our special three-part Circularity in Furniture webinar series as a part of Circular City Week. This has been co-presented with our partners mebl, Transforming Furniture, and the Sustainable Furnishings Council. It's now my pleasure to pass it on to our moderator for today, Susan Inglis from SFC.
Thank you so much, Tulasi, and thank you to all our panelists and guests for being here. Welcome to everybody. It's such a pleasure to have you as part of Circular City Week, a very exciting occurrence in Zoom land as well as in New York City itself, for sharing knowledge and best practices that accelerate the transition to a more circular economy. This is the second of three events this week that are examining three promising levers of change. Today, our focus is on public policy strategy. Monday's panel had a great discussion on business strategy, and tomorrow we will be talking about design practice. While our examples today are drawn mostly from furniture and the consumer goods space, we think that you are going to find these strategies highly applicable across many industries. So this series is brought to you in a collaborative effort of mebl, Transforming Furniture, the Sustainable Furnishings Council, and the American Sustainable Business Network. Sustainable Furnishings Council is a coalition of manufacturers and retailers and designers and others in residential furnishings, all of whom are dedicated to raising awareness and expanding the adoption of environmentally sustainable practices across our industry. We're 15 years old now. mebl, Transforming Furniture, is committed to bold systems change toward circularity in the furniture industry by creating educational content and interactive exhibits, developing information resources, and facilitating cross-sector collaboration. And the American Sustainable Business Network develops and advocates solutions for policymakers, for business leaders, and investors that support an equitable, regenerative, and just economy that benefits all of us on the planet and the planet itself. Today, we have a strong lineup of panelists who have navigated business and policy of the circular economy, though it wasn't always called that, as we were saying just a bit ago. So we've got a lot of expertise here, and I want to first introduce myself. Susan Inglis, Director of Sustainable Furnishings Council since we began, but now resident expert and educator-in-chief at Sustainable Furnishings Council and a proud board member of American Sustainable Business Network. I'm joined by these panelists: Gat Caperton, who is president and CEO of Gat Creek and a board member of Sustainable Furnishings Council; Jeffrey Hollander, the CEO and co-founder of ASBN and co-founder and the former CEO of Seventh Generation; and Stephanie Irwin, who is the Director of Circular Economy Policy at ASBN and will be giving us a brief overview of what circular economy policy is for those who aren't familiar. It's a great place to start. So this is a great opportunity to learn from leaders who've played on various sides of this issue. before we go into Stephanie's policy overview, I want to point out to our audience that you can put your questions in the question box at any point, and we're going to address your questions after we've had our discussion. Please try to submit your questions by 1:40. You can also chat, as I see many people are already doing. So with that, Stephanie, I want to turn it over to you, please, to give us a policy brief.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. I'm excited to be here and try to encapsulate what circular economy policy is so we can all have a good starting place to start the discussion. And I'll share my screen in a moment. But I'm obviously not gonna be able to get through everything, but I just kind of want to make sure we're all on the same page when we're discussing this. So to start, I kind of want to take a moment to sort of touch base on sustainability versus circular economy. I think that, these terms are used semi-interchangeably, but I do want to note that, while they do have overlap, they do have different goals ultimately. Sustainability strives for a triple bottom line that values social, economic, and environmental considerations equally, whereas circular economy at its core is about economic activity. So while social and environmental considerations are important and can be considered, they aren't necessarily the part of the discussion when it comes to circular economy policy. This is based in economic waste, pollution, recycling of products. So these, for example, if you were to cycle a material like plastic endlessly, you would have to make sure that it was just plastic you are recycling over and over again. If you had any sort of coating on the plastic, you would have to take that out before you could recycle it endlessly. So you have to consider that just because it's circular doesn't mean it's sustainable.
Good point.
So also just wanted to make sure we're all talking with the same language, using the stages of the life of a product life cycle. These are generally the sort of standard terms that are used in like a life cycle analysis. So when you're talking about policy, you're generally creating policies that address one or more steps in this system. And right now we're largely operating in a linear open loop system, but the goal is to, move towards a closed loop, more circular system that would, one day hopefully look more like this, where you're no longer extracting raw materials or resources, virgin resources, you're simply cycling these materials through the system over and over again, looking to recycle or upcycle in the terms of Ellen MacArthur's definition. You want to keep them at their highest grade so they can be used endlessly. So also in terms of terminology, speaking from a basis of goods. So, when you're creating policy, you want to create things differently for things that are single use or non-durable versus things that are durable. So in the economic definition, that's 3+ years. So, things that, like furniture would be treated differently than a water bottle that you bought at the grocery store, not only because they're different materials, but because they last, the use cycle is much shorter. And, when we're creating policies, we also have to consider the materials themselves, because it's the materials that are circling through the economy, as well as the products. So, we would eventually want to be able to recycle these materials. You would want them to get down to their base material. So when we're looking at policies, when I'm discussing policies in a second, I'll be discussing them based on, their product or the material. So this is going to be complicated. So hopefully we can just walk through it one by one, but, policy mechanisms that are very common, I'll discuss ones that are active and pending, but pricing is a big one. So, the reason why plastic is so common and cheap and a practical option for many businesses is because there's fossil fuel subsidies that make plastic cheap. So there's currently a potential tax that's being proposed in Congress on taxing plastic resin that would maybe balance that subsidy out. You also see plastic bag taxes at the state level. Another popular mechanism are bottle bills, which are, you pay for something, and then if you take it back to a designated recycling center, you would get the deposit that you paid back. The difference in a lot of these policies is in the bottle bill funding, the deposit scheme, the consumer gets the money back or whoever returns the bill, whereas with the plastic bag tax or some of these other taxes or pricing schemes, there would be a fund created or it would go to the government. So these are some examples of pricing mechanisms. There's also straight up bans, plastic bag bans. There's a federal legislation up for banning the sale of plastic at national parks. So that's something that's coming up on the agenda as well. Another important policy mechanism is disclosure. So this is about consumer education. When you're going to the store and you see a recycle sign, you want to know that it's recyclable. So there's been legislation in California recently to make sure that if it says it's recyclable, it's readily recyclable and not, it doesn't say it's recyclable, but then when you go to your transport station or they're like, oh, we don't take that number here. And you're kind of like, what? Is this even recyclable? So there's lots of, California is the first to come out with a new scheme on chasing arrows is what they call it. But there's several states where this has become a factor. And New York also has a specific legislation out on fashion and textiles specifically, which will which will ask companies to disclose more about their impact. So that's another great example of pending legislation that's out. Also, something that's really important is standards. So when you're going to create a company based on reuse, health and safety codes are top of mind because those can help or hinder your sort of cleaning processes. Like I'm sure Rent the Runway thinks about this. There's RCUP has the event recycling, and they think about this too when they're starting new businesses in new states. There's the other big thing is right to repair. Do electronic companies have to make it easier for consumers to get their electronics repaired? And the gold standard of circular economy policy is EPR, extended producer responsibility. In the States, there's been a recent rise in carpet and mattressing recycling, which is great because it helps companies to start thinking from the beginning, from the design stage. And so that's sort of that's what we want, is we want it to go back to the beginning of the product life cycle stages and really thinking from the beginning, how can we design this to be more circular from the beginning. When we looked at some of these other materials, a lot of them were focused more on the end of life stage. So these EPR policies are what we ideally would want to move towards if we wanted to really transition all of these materials and these product goods to a more circular economy. And that's it for me. Thanks so much, Susan. I'll pass it back to you.
Good. Thank you, Stephanie. Before I take it back completely, I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, if you could give us a synopsis.
Yeah. And that's like the sort of preeminent piece of legislation, I think, in the circular economy policy world right now. And that is about mandating certain recycling content standards. It's about moving away from, virgin plastic materials. It also has, some thinking more about PFAS and plastic as well. So it covers quite a comprehensive model bill. And I highly recommend that everyone checks it out and checks out Break Free from Plastic's website as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I am sure we're going to be coming back to you with more specific questions like that. But with this understanding, I want to turn to you, Gat, and you, Jeffrey, now to talk. And I want you to please start with telling us something about your circular economy journey to this point and how you've engaged with policy as part of that journey. You can be as specific as you please, but we'll be interested to know what policies you've engaged with or, being for or against that policy. Jeffrey, I'm going to start with you, please.
Thanks, Susan. Happy to be with everyone today. Such an important subject that we're discussing. And to tell you a little bit about my own journey, as I spent many decades in the sustainable, responsible business world, one of the things that became clear to me is that while it's great to create businesses like Seventh Generation, Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, many companies that are members of ASBN, it's great to create these companies that are exceptions to the rules, that don't put practices in place because they're forced to, but they choose to do so voluntarily. That could be paying a living wage instead of a minimum wage. The challenge that we face is those exceptions to the rules don't bring about enough change to address the challenges that we're facing, like climate change or social inequity. And we need to change the rules rather than just be exceptions to the rules, which is great, and we want companies to continue to do that. To address the challenges we're facing, we have to change those rules. And that's really what public policy is all about. It's about changing the rules upon which business gets done. And for me specifically, most recently, one of the rules that I've been the most focused on is the new SEC climate disclosure rules. This is critically important to have public companies have to quantify and discuss the potential risks and challenges that might come from their CO2 emissions. And that is a really important step that creates transparency about company operations and gives investors and potential employees and other stakeholders vitally important information about a company's operation. Even more important than that would be ultimately putting a price on carbon so that we don't let business externalize the negative impact of CO2 emissions, and we insist that they pay the cost for the damages that are done by those CO2 emissions. So that's just a little bit about my own current focus and my own journey.
Great, thank you. And your journey did include getting this organization, ASBN, going. So I want to thank you for that, as well as for the good, responsible businesses you've led. Thank you. Gat, I want to turn to you now. Your experience in a furniture company is very different from experience in a cleaning products company, but you are equally committed to being responsible in your business.
Yeah, and I'll tell a little bit of a history to kind of tell about the journey, because this my business was in many ways started in a circular economy and in a circular distribution, and has become linear over the last 40 years, 50 years. I bought this business 25 years ago, but it was essentially founded 50 years ago in the 1950s, and the founder is called Tom Seeley. He was a antique guy. He went to antique sales, estate sales, bought people's old furniture, fixed it up, and drove it into Baltimore, DC, and sold it. True kind of a reuse circular economy type business. That business grew very well in classic 1950s era, where there was really greater demand and supply. And eventually he started building copies of his favorite antiques. So in some ways, we go way back with circularity here. Today, we build a product that's a solid wood product. It's beautifully built. It's built to last years and be reused and such. But the journey of this overall business has been very interesting. Just watching our industry, and Susan, you and I have worked a lot with this last 15 years, and that it went very linear, very fast. And we've been trying to fight against that ever since, both in terms of we take certain pride in what we do, but it's just crazy the system around. So back in the 50s, people were happy to reuse furniture. It was well made, it was beautiful, it had long lasting, and did so, and there really wasn't much furniture around. Ultimately, with the baby boom generation just being so many people, so many houses, it had to move to where you had to produce more furniture. You just couldn't recircuit. You had to bring more into the product, and that was done well for a long time. Obviously, in the last 30 years, we've seen a lot of producers kind of give up on producing. Building furniture, building durables is hard work, and building it well is hard work. And a lot of people have just simply outsourced that to Asia, where the externalities are almost invisible to them. Of course, a lot of companies have done a nice job going back in that channel and starting to do a better and better job. But we watch this entire a somewhat circular industry flatten out. And today, the challenge today is that there's a lot of landfill furniture that you wouldn't rebuy or reuse. So there's not a lot of options. Still, the primary option today is new, as opposed to looking for reuse. And those are things that we'll look and talk about today, about how to do that better.
Yeah, thank you, Gat. I want to get you to talk a tiny bit about how in these 25 years that it's been your business, you have engaged with policy. I hear you saying that it's in the business that circularity and linearity have come in, but you have experience engaging in policy.
Yeah. This is a tough policy issue because it's hard to dictate quality. It's hard to dictate materials, and and a lot of that is really has to be consumer driven as opposed to policy driven. And obviously, policies could help get consumers around their arms around that. But for consumer durables, it's a lot of education. I think is really what helps move the needle the most right now.
Yeah. Good. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how can business take action to support policy that complements and incentivizes new and better ways of thinking and doing business. So that is education. So I'll turn back to you, Jeffrey, and maybe you can talk about how you have seen success in business educating their own customers and the consuming public to have them be more enthusiastic about better policies.
Yeah. Well, let me start with the influence that business has relative to public policy, because as an engine for employment and the generation of taxes that are paid to the government, legislators pay a lot of attention to what businesses have to say. And it is really important that we use that voice to promote responsible legislation, because you can be sure that other people like the fossil fuel industry, the plastics industry, the medical industry, they're going to be very vocal in talking about what's good for them, and what's good for them is not always what's good for us. So be vocal. And one of the ways to start being vocal is to just participate in a sign-on letter. ASBN is frequently running sign-on letters in support of different public policy. And we have a letter right now to the SEC about the climate disclosure rules that they are considering. So one thing to do is participate in these sign-in letters, and they do make a difference. You might think they don't, but legislators pay attention, especially legislators that are in your home district. Second thing to do is be vocal. Show up in your local state house. Show up with us in Washington as we go around and talk face to face with legislators. And again, That's really, really important. Now, as individual consumers, we can do many of the same things, and it's important that we all use our voice. We are in a world where there's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars being spent by business on public policy. And unfortunately, what they're spending their money on, one of the things that we faced as a big challenge at Seventh Generation is that there's $1 billion a year spent to subsidize virgin timber. Now, that may be good for GATT, I'm not sure, but it's not good for people selling tissue paper made from recycled fiber, because the subsidies of virgin fiber artificially create greater expense or the appearance of greater expense for recycled fiber. And that's a subsidy we want to see go away. So public policy is critical. Individuals and businesses can play a very important role and need to do so.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate all that American Sustainable Business Network does to engage us as businesses. GATT, I wonder what you have to add on that, and on what do you have to add on that?
Sure, I'll add on a couple of points. Of course, in my journey in this, I woke up one day and with the great Dr. Seuss book about cutting down all the trees, and I, woke up and said, "Geez, I don't want to be that guy," and an industrialist. And luckily, hardwood trees, which what we work with, and the softwood, which becomes paper and cardboard and other stuff like that, are actually two different ecologies and two different stories. So we don't share that benefit that you talk about in terms of paying people to get virgin timber. We're lucky to source out of the Appalachian forests. In the forest today, trees are growing 2.4 times faster than they're dying or being cutting down. So it's actually an expanding, living, thriving forest in about any measure you can have. So we're very lucky, and we're right in the middle of that source. So we're very lucky in terms of our raw material being, ample, sustainable, and local. So in some ways we're lucky. So that puts us a little bit ahead. Back with just the policy, I totally agree, and I really appreciate the American Sustainable Business Network, because it takes groups like this to help move the needle, and it's very valuable. We obviously participate with ASBN. We also participate with our local manufacturing, local statewide manufacturing association. Some of these guys would be quickly considered bad players, but they're major players, and if you move bad to better, you're still moving the needle. So we try to engage in both levels because it's just that important.
Yeah, it is that important. So maybe talk a little bit, and I love it that you're mentioning working with groups that don't see eye to eye on everything. But you talk a little bit about how you as a business person what do you look for in choosing what policy to engage on?
Yeah, I think obviously we talked a little about stuff that helps that helps with consumers, but ultimately, sustainability needs to be profitable. So what you really need to be doing, working towards things that reduce energy, that reduce and keeps negative externalities, bad materials out of systems. So I love to be able to, keep it a cleaner product, reduced energy to go in product, and try to simplify. The hardest thing is, post-consumer recycling. It's just getting anything back to a place to where you can actually process it and reuse it. So all of those are things that I look forward and try to find opportunities to advance.
Yeah. So that Security and Exchange Commission, our concern that the Security and Exchange Commission require reporting on climate impact would be right in line with the kinds of things you're talking about.
Yeah, it's fabulous. I love when Jeffrey pointed out. I think it's been very surprisingly impactful how that has been, and it's been good because it becomes public knowledge, and people have enforced that. The SAC's somewhat enforced it, and just the general population has followed behind that, and it has brought a lot of big companies and a lot of companies to task, which I think has been awesome. It's important.
Yeah. So, Jeffrey, you have addressed a little bit what you look for in choosing how to engage with what policies, but do you want to elaborate on that a bit now?
Sure, I'd love to. What we're looking for is policy that brings about systemic change. We have so many challenges that we're facing. If we just think about toxic chemicals, it's one thing to try to remove chemicals that are toxic and carcinogenic one at a time. It's another thing to pass legislation that requires universal disclosure on the toxic impact of all chemicals for consumers and people in the supply chain. Just like we talked about before about putting a price on carbon, that would bring about systemic change. ASBN did a wonderful webinar with a man named George Serafim from Harvard about revolutionizing accounting. And what George did is he calculated how the profitability and balance sheet of companies would change if they had to pay for their carbon emissions. Having to pay for those carbon emissions would have a dramatic effect on the earnings of many companies. ExxonMobil would have over $100 billion of additional expense that they don't now have because we don't make them responsible for those emissions. You can bet that if all of a sudden companies had to pay for their emissions, they wouldn't be so focused on emitting carbon. They would be focused on minimizing that carbon emission, capturing that carbon emission, avoiding it in the first place so that they wouldn't have that expense. Mm-hmm. Companies do, in many ways, what the rules and regulations design them to do. And unfortunately, in many cases, we've created the wrong incentives, the wrong design that encourages the wrong type of behavior. Encouraging businesses to externalize their costs is just not a good idea because it encourages the wrong kind of behavior. So we look for things of that sort that bring about systemic change, things that would change the way all businesses operate and move them towards a more circular, more sustainable economy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important. Stephanie, I want
let me jump in. I'll just jump in and add to what Jeff said, which is very good. And one of the things that we face in our industry that frustrates me is that too often, and as that becomes hopefully more and more reality, too often people export some of that stuff. So they basically will export the evil and bring in the product. So I think it's important also as we go through this to continue to think about, access to our market from other markets, outside markets that aren't, playing to the same rules or working to the degree we are. It's the more we can keep, people to universally keep people at the same higher level, the more success we'll have.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Stephanie, I want to bring you back in, and I want to, if it's easy, for you to put back up the slide that shows all those different kinds of policies, because we've touched on a couple of different things here as we've been going along, and I'd love for you to speak to where we see there is momentum. And what made me think of this was your mention, Jeffrey, of fossil fuel subsidies. We, as you say, we have got our subsidies in the wrong place. and I think this might tie, and maybe y'all can comment, to legislation around plastics, where a lot of fossil fuels companies are putting more of their attention on using that fuel for plastics. Still a subsidized thing, still a way polluting business to be in. So, Stephanie, can you speak a little bit to where we see there is momentum?
Yes, I'm happy to. So right now, a lot of momentum around extended producer responsibilities. So those are either product or material specific. So like I said, carpets and mattresses when it comes to fibers. And then, with this break free from plastic, that's, a very has a very strong activist base. And so, having more businesses join this coalition would be very powerful. And California also has the plastic reduction ballot initiative coming up soon. And they also have the SB 54, which is proposed by Senator Allen. So those are very sort of strong, end all be all circular economy policies that are up for the agenda. And I also would add, in light of the fossil fuel conversation, that the American Chemistry Association or Council, they're also really hard at work right now trying to get advanced recycling and chemical recycling added to the agenda. And this is very much would reinforce the linear reality that we're currently in, where you are incinerating plastic, at the end of life, as opposed to recycling it. And so that's also something that's really important to point out is there's a huge industry push to get advanced recycling to count as a form of recycling, even though it's technically burning plastic. And there are countries in the EU that have been doing this for years, and it has recently become a question that maybe they shouldn't have done it, or maybe they moved too quickly into these technologies. So it's also really important to think about these things as well.
Yeah. Great to point out to our audience that that there is some fake recycling that is seeking support it doesn't deserve. So yes. So thank you very much for helping us with that. I do want to remind people to put your questions in the chat or in the questions, because we're going to get to those in just a minute here. On that chart, we see that mattress recycling is one of the things that there is that we're trotting right along in, which is great. Mattresses are bulky, and so it has made sense for mattress recycling to be to have some success. Some furniture should be recycled in those same facilities. So make sure when you're exploring mattress recycling in your community, you explore whether furniture that cannot be repaired could be disassembled and recycled, because a sofa, for instance, is going to be made of the same things as a mattress. But really, furniture needs to last a long time, and it's the furniture packaging that we need to see recycled. And as we begin to move into questions here, Gat, can you say what would make it easier for your company to have more packaging recyclable materials you're using, and ensuring that it is recycled? What in policy would make that easier for a durable furniture company like yours?
All right, that's a long answer, actually. It's a real challenge, because obviously, I'll give you an example. I think actually,
Okay.
we actually have really lightened up a lot of our packaging. There's a certain assumptions, things through the distribution system, that you want to package it as much as possible and make it bulletproof so gorillas could handle it, and blah come out fine, which is nice. We've actually worked the process of really trying to minimize packaging. So if you look at one of our pieces of furniture, move it through a place, it looks like it's vulnerable, as opposed to something that's very packaged, because it is lightweight, and we basically put it back in a distribution system to handle it better than they would something from China that has EPS foam in it. That's been our best approach, but it doesn't always work. There's people that insist, I want to have, I want cardboard everywhere, and I want a box inside of a box. We fight that every day, to be honest with you. And we find that as you minimize it, people actually treat it better, and you actually have better success to the system.
Interesting. And so policy to require that policy that would help you have to use less packaging would be helpful there, it sounds like.
There's a lot of policy in place, both in there's trucking, systems. There's a UPS policy that you got to have inside a box, this and that and that. all that stuff. Some people are re-looking at that in a wise way, but not enough are. And there's real opportunity to put a little common sense in the packaging.
Yeah,
Susan, in places like Germany, the packaging must be taken back by the company that uses the packaging. And you can bet that if you've got to take that packaging back from the consumer and take responsibility for recycling it, you think very carefully about how much packaging you put out into the marketplace.
Yes. And
I heard that. I
also,
like that idea. That's pretty cool. I mean,
it is cool. It is cool. And also in Germany at the supermarket, you can leave packaging behind that you don't want to take out of the supermarket with you, which is great. And Gat, your furniture often is delivered to the customer by your customer, the store. The store often delivers it wrapped in a blanket, which is reusable, used again and again. And that is a good solution for a lot of furniture.
Yeah, it sure is. And we used to blanket wrap stuff ourselves in the day. And there's a certain, as long as you, our store network has a nice setup for that. So yeah, it's typically minimized packaging to a store, and then the last mile delivery is done in a blanket, which is nice. So it's not being unpackaged and repackaged. Smart.
Yeah, that's a good solution. Y'all, we're beginning to get some questions. So I want to turn to those questions now. And I'll make sure that when we wrap up the questions, both of you get to say a final word. So first question is for Gat. What is the source of Gat Creek's wood? Is it made from Forest Stewardship Council certified wood? And I will add to that, do you use any urban salvage or any other material that you want to tell us about?
No, so all our wood comes out of the Appalachian forest. It's certified for coming out of the forest by an Appalachian Hardwood Manufacturers Association. And that forest we have a 70-year history of sustainability in terms of truly growing 2.4 more trees per one's dying being taken out. So it's a growing and sustainable forest. We do not have third-party certification as in SFC certification, or I get, sorry, too many acronyms sometimes. Excuse me for not doing that right. I really appreciate that certification, and I think it's absolutely critical for someone that's sourcing wood in forests that aren't sustainable and areas that aren't doing legal timbering. So I've always tried to support that, but domestically, it's a little bit redundant for where we're bringing product out. I have done some work with both reclaimed wood in the past, where people take down barns and us build product out of it. And that was a ton of fun and cool, but very tough because every barn's different. You kind of have to redesign product around each time. So I'm not actively in that process. I've done some work with some of the urban forestry places, which I think is going to be a nice opportunity for some of the urban woods. That's a ton of fun. A lot of the urban woods are elm, which makes terrible furniture, unfortunately. But some of it is really good and cool. And they have great acronyms like UFA, Urban Forestry Association, which I always love saying UFA, which are very cool. I think often a lot of the stuff that's coming out of the urban areas are really going to make really nice flooring, better so that furniture. You'll get better usage out of it, better turns. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of it go. It's really exciting to see these urban areas do more and more reuse of both buildings that they tear down, and which they do really nicely in Baltimore these days, and just with trees that they come down.
Yeah, good points. And the Urban Wood Network is another great organization working in that space so that all the trees that come out of our cities are used.
And next week, tomorrow, Room Boy is going to talk in this group about their work with urban wood, which is really fabulous. It's a great story. You'll enjoy it. Tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you. Good. Jeffrey, next question is for you. What is a specific example of a real-life sustainability policy success story, and what ultimately made the difference to make it a success?
One of the biggest successes that we've had at ASBN is something called the Jobs Act that democratized capital for business investment and allowed smaller investors to participate in private placements. And as I'm sure Gat knows, it's not always easy for businesses to get the capital they need to grow. And many businesses, particularly businesses that are run by women or minorities, have a particularly difficult time. And the Jobs Act, which was passed several years ago, really democratized that process and increased access to capital for many companies. That's something that we specifically worked on and championed, something that we were influential in getting passed on a federal basis. These public policy wins sometimes are hard to come by. And it's also critical in many cases that there are coalitions of organizations that work together to pass legislation. In many cases, we're often not the only one who is advocating for a public policy change. We will often go out in some cases and have 10, 20, 30, even 40 other organizations who are advocating with us. So that collaborative process is really important when trying to get public policy passed.
Collaboration, great, thank you. The next question I am going to answer: what materials are being recycled in mattresses? How is it handling polyurethane foams? In mattresses, things are taken apart by hand. So people are used for that. Jobs are created in that. It is a very manually intense process. The fabric is most often mixed fibers and it goes into shoddy that goes into insulation. The foam that you're asking about specifically is baled and is used for carpet underlayment finally. There was a hole, and the wood is chipped and is used for mulch, and the metal is extracted and is used for more metal. It's just recycled as metal. And there was a whole session about this yesterday that you can probably find a recording of on the Circular City Week network. So next, I am going to see what questions have come in the chat. Let's see, maybe that isn't where I was supposed to look for them. Y'all be okay. Here I have seen, and now I found them. Thank you. Thank you for putting them where I'm supposed to be looking for them. How can we influence policymakers to demand sustainable and chemical-free home furnishings? Do you see a particular role for public and private initiatives? And for those very responsible companies that are benefit corporations, what is their particular role? I'm going to throw that out to the both of you.
There's been a couple successes in basically keeping chemicals out of furniture lately. They've now the California Air Standard, the CARB 2 standard for formaldehyde is now a national standard. It's Title 6, I believe the term is now, instead of CARB 2, and that's been a great success. We've gotten plasticizers pretty good out of at least the wood furniture finishes out of good. So that's important. And there's actually been good policy success along that. There's more to be done, especially with the forever type chemicals that can sneak into some things, especially some upholstery and fire retardants, which we've actually had nice progress on the fire retardants too as well. So there's been good progress. It's critical. I think in terms of consumers, it's critical to the consumer because a healthy home is critical to first and people. And we like to kind of say the same first guys. A healthy planet starts with a healthy home, and that's near and dear to people's hearts. It's a great question to ask.
If you look across the ocean again, because in many ways Europe is leading us in this area, the REACH legislation around chemicals is really the state-of-the-art legislation that we need to mirror in the United States. And when you're trying to get that kind of legislation passed, it's often very important to make the business case for why the legislation is needed. What happens when you bring toxins into the home that pollute the air? What's the cost associated with the asthma, allergy, and rising cancer rates when people are exposed to these toxic chemicals? And in many cases, the cost of eliminating a chemical is far less than the health cost associated with continuing to leave it on the market. But making those business cases for legislators are really important so that they can understand the benefits that will accrue to our economy and to consumers globally for this kind of progressive legislation.
Excellent. Thank you. I'd like to ask this question of both of you too. How can employee stakeholders help to drive positive policy lobbying from within companies that'll be fundamentally disrupted by policy? I think, Gat, of a chair frame manufacturer that was using a very toxic glue, and it was the employees who were suffering the most, you know? So how do employees lobby from within? And I'm sure both of you are going to have something to add, to contribute on that.
Yeah, boy, there's really no one, one of the best positioned people are truly employees that are working with some of this material. To be a red flag, you hate to make employees, the canary in the coal mine, as we like to say in West Virginia, term we use, which is not the way to go about it, but it is an important link and an opportunity. And there's nice stories. So
yeah, Jeffrey, do you have any how-to stories for employees?
Sure. I mean, employees have to do the same thing that businesses do with legislators. They have to make the business case to their management. They have to basically say, by creating a safer workplace, we will use less money from health insurance to cover our illnesses. So making an investment of $5,000 to remove certain chemicals from the workplace may result in $100,000 of fewer claims made on health insurance that will ultimately lead to lower health insurance prices. Employees have to be sophisticated enough to make those kinds of business cases to their management because they're the most compelling things. Management is always looking for ways, sometimes too many ways, to increase profitability. If you can make a business case around things from a sustainability perspective that will improve the financial performance of your company, I think you'll find that your management will be very interested in hearing about.
I bet you're right. Yeah.
And especially for employees, basically everything you bring into a factory in the United States, you have to have an SDS for, which used to be an MDS, material safety data sheet, which would tell you exactly what you're working with. So in our facility, we have a huge amount of red line chemicals that just don't ever make it in our door. And an employee could easily audit that. Something we had that there's open access to everyone in our facility to see. So
that's great. Good. I want to talk about an inclusive and intersectional approach. The question is, how do we create system change through an inclusive intersectional approach, including engaging the practices of Black feminism? How can we be heard in a world of men and conformists looking for profits only? Any thoughts on that?
Oh, I wish I could have answered. I wish I could have typed such an eloquent question. That's fantastic, and I believe that's a great shortfall. Just tell you, we're a manufacturing company. We're 53% women, and I just think it's absolutely critical to have both genders and be inclusive in what you do and your decision maker and your leadership of an organization. It's absolutely critical, and it's a great miss that we have throughout our economy right now.
And we need them at the table with us when we're building these coalitions and making decisions. There's no replacement for inclusion and participation in making sure that when you're building the coalition, the coalition mirrors the people that you're trying to benefit and trying to help. And it's a challenge. We have a terrible history in this country of marginalizing women and minorities, and we have to go out of our way. One of the best books I've ever read was How to Be an Anti-Racist, and it taught me a lot about the importance of inclusion and how to disrupt and change what is a very troubling and challenging history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It sure is. Yeah, yeah. The next question we've got has just come in the questions is this. How are businesses currently keeping track of the changes in policy and regulations needed to achieve a circular economy? What are the main challenges of being up to date with such a fragmented environment and so many regulatory bodies at the federal, state, and local level?
Well, I'm gonna give you a very
Yeah.
self-serving answer, which is join ASBN,
Yeah,
because you'll have access to incredible experts like Stephanie, who's
yeah,
tracking all this legislation, who can tell you when to show up, who to talk to, what to say, how to make the business case for your perspective. And that's really one of the benefits that the American Sustainable Business Network offers, is monitoring that legislation all across the United States and making sure that you show up at the right place in the right time with the right message to
yeah.
influence the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stephanie, I do so appreciate your expertise. You should turn on your camera for just a minute. And I appreciate too that fabulous chart you made for us, and that you have shared that chart in the chat. So anybody who wants it can click that link. And I did, it looks like several people wanted. So thank you for that. I want what do either of you want to say in just a minute, or if any of you want to say in just a minute or less? Gat, Jeffrey, Stephanie.
I'll jump in. It's fun to work with Jeffrey, and I've always been a big fan of Seventh Generation. But the product is a great product, but it's really a great example of doing something different and overcoming the inertia of just continuing doing everything else does and doing something wrong. And I find examples like that very inspirational and very helpful. Even though I have a durable product versus a non-durable product, I always search out for the examples, and I truly appreciate it. Obviously, people on this event here are doing the same, and I applaud you for it.
Me too. Anything in conclusion, Jeffrey?
No, just that, look, we've got to show up. We've got to make our voice heard. We are facing some real critical challenges in this country, the circular economy being one of them, but we're facing some tough challenges.
Yeah.
And it is incumbent upon us to show up, be counted, and make our voice heard so that we influence the outcome of issues like climate change that are getting worse a lot quicker than they're getting better.
You are right. Thank you for all you and Stephanie and everybody is doing. And thank you to Circular City Week for having this festival this week and for including us. We're going to share 3 sets of links in the chat. mebl and SFC are excited to be releasing the Circular Design Glossary for Furniture and Furnishings in the coming weeks. We are on the cusp of releasing this thing. So go to the link in the chat for a peek and to be notified when it's completely available. GAT, it provides an example. GAT Creek illustrates traceability in the glossary. As we said before, there's one more session tomorrow produced by ASBN and mebl and SFC on circularity and design. And there are also lots more events that have to do with circularity and furniture. There's going to be a feedback survey, so that I hope that you will take a minute or two to fill that out. And we're going to be sharing the recording of this with the chat log and with the resource list in the coming days. So you'll get all of that. thank you all very much. It has been great to be in this discussion with you, and I look forward to its continuing. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, guys.